Well, welcome everyone to our next program in the series of hazardous waste requirements, printing sector focus.
Yeah.
So today our topic is going to focus on the inspection process during COVID, as well as
sent out and I'll see what they say, but
record
my guess is
keeping.
they still have nobody to do it. I'm sure.
Okay, whoever's talking, you need to mute.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, did you ever get a hold of your insurance guy for an appointment?
He said he's coming up this week.
Okay.
He told me last week, but that's not happening. So
All right, who
he
is
can let me know a day
muted?
ahead of time when he gets here, or before he gets here. So
You need to mute him.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to just pick his brain a little bit if that's all right.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, once again, welcome to our session on inspection process during COVID and record keeping. And this is part of our hazardous waste regulation update series, and we're on the 5th program. I do want to say that in the chat, I placed a link to the I placed a link to the recordings of the earlier programs, as well as I believe you can find them on the Great Lakes Graphics Association's website. So your program is brought to you by the Printing United Alliance, Sustainable Green Printing Partnership Program, the Flexographic Technical Association, TLMI, the Wisconsin Green Tier Program, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and we are being hosted by the Great Lakes Graphics Association. So we've all banded together to bring you these programs, and we do hope that you are finding them both useful and beneficial as you navigate your way through the changes of the hazardous waste regulations. So my name is Marcy Kinter, and I'm the Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs for the Printing United Alliance. And I'm really glad to be able to moderate our session today. So before we begin, a few logistics. All attendees are now muted. If you have a question or comment, there's a chat box in the lower center of your screen. Please go ahead and enter it at any time. And I encourage you, there is no such thing as a silly question. Please go ahead and put your questions in, and then we will be answering them at the end of our program. So today's program is being recorded, and in a follow-up email, you will get not only the recording, but also you will get a copy of the slides. As I indicated, we are on session 5 of 6 sessions. We have already covered the introduction and common violations. We looked at waste determinations and land disposal restrictions. We then had a conversation on generator status and episodic generation. And then our last session focused on hazardous waste management, transport, and reporting. And again, these recordings can be found at the printer portal on the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources site, as well as through Great Lakes Graphics Association. And today, our session is going to be looking at inspections and record keeping. So today's session, as I said, we're going to take a look at the process that has taken place during COVID, as well as an inspector's perspective. And I think that will be fascinating and interesting. So our speaker today is Ben Petrus. I hope I pronounced that right, Ben. And Ben graduated from UW Stout Point with a degree in soil and waste resource management. He then went on to work in Iowa for the hazardous waste disposal industry before he joined the Department of Natural Resources as an inspector. And he does right now, he conducts hazardous waste compliance inspections and does provide technical assistance. So with that, Ben, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marcy. And just as an addition, I've been with the DNR now just shy of 4 years. So, well, thank you. If you could move along to the next slide. So today I'm planning on breaking this up into 2 parts. First, focusing on that inspections component, what that looks like during the COVID time period. And then the second part will be more on the perspectives and kind of some record keeping best practices, expectations, and some tools that we have available for sites. So the inspection portion, I wanted to lay out what this typically looks like for the process at large, and then I'll dial in on each individual components as we go along. You could move, Marcy. So first, what is the authority that we as inspectors have to conduct inspections? And in the state of Wisconsin, that's a statutory authority that comes from 291-91. I gave a small subset of that here, and the most relevant to inspections portion are that any person who generates, stores, treats, transports, or disposes of hazardous waste shall be granted access to vehicles, services, and records relating to the hazardous waste reasonable time. Really what this just boils down to is, you know, as a regulatory authority, we have the authority to come do an inspection, typically within, you know, normal business hours. Most often under a typical time frame. This is an unannounced inspection with the current COVID-19 pandemic going on. We've adjusted the process to better account for that and the health and safety risk associated with that. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So with that in mind, we have tried to focus our current inspections. Sorry, say that again. Oh, I'll keep going. Safety is our primary goal at this time, and to really accomplish that, we're trying to, as much as possible, limit time on site. So that involves off-site review of the majority of the records that we would encounter or normally review on site. Limiting on-site meetings, and that's primarily opening conferences, closing conferences. Those are conducted through virtual meetings. In most cases, we use Skype conference calls that we'll set up and invite with you. And depending on the actual on-site situation, this may result in a self-audit or a on-site inspection and walkthrough of the processes at waste and how that's managed and disposed. You can move ahead. So once again, our typical inspections are unannounced. It's a full inspection that takes place with all of the records of view, all of the photos, questions, opening, closing conferences, and that takes typically 4 to 8 hours on site. It can take longer. It might even require multiple site visits to fully get a handle on everything, and especially in the cases of tanks and fugitive emission standards, that can take even more time. So we're trying to minimize that as much as possible right now. And so that process for the remote desktop inspection is to first contact the facility, request those records that we would need, and then make that assessment based off of our COVID survey that we've currently developed for the operations of the site and the current risk level for both us coming on site to the facility and the risk to us. And I'll reference this survey multiple times through the presentation, and it's a series of questions that we've developed that really look at whether or not the site's currently operating, if there's been any impact on the site from a staffing standpoint, any closures throughout the year or the previous year, but mostly what's going to impact us and the questions for the site is whether or not there's any current or recent known COVID infections that have been diagnosed, and that will, impact how we proceed with some of the next steps of the process. If you can move forward, please. So that first step in the process right now is to do an initial site contact, to call up the individuals that we have on our system for as a primary site contact. And we're doing that based off of largely the information provided to us by any of the sites we're visiting. And so it can be really important to make sure that you're updating through your annual reports or any notification forms, the most current individual that you'd like us to be reaching out to in this type of circumstance. And while we're doing that call, we'll try and be assessing whether or not the person we're reaching out to is the most appropriate for the site. Also, the point of calling is to inform the facility of the inspection and then to run through that survey initially to try and get a handle on the time frame and how what the impact has been for the site and if the site's currently operating or not. Following that initial call, well, part of that initial call is to explain the actual process of what the inspection is currently, and then to follow that up with an email. And in that email will be both a records request and then a summary of the current process and timelines and expectations. If you could move ahead, Marcy. So also in that email will be, like I said, the list is required, which I'll go into some depth here in just a moment. It also describes how we would like those records to be transferred to us. Typically, this will either be by email or if there's a belief that those files may be too large, easily transfer. For us, our email cap is, I think, 24 megs to be able to send or receive an email. If those records are either large in volume or just large in size individually, it might make sense to request a box.com account be set up, which one of our staffers will do, and then the information can be placed into a folder that we have access to, and we'll look at it that way and start reviewing the process from that. It also lays out that a time frame, the expectation for that information is to be sent to us within 14 days of the initial call and email. It also covers a brief reminder that as of September 1st, Wisconsin promulgated a new rule set, which brings us up to date with the majority of the EPA's federal rule sets, including the generator improvement rule, which covers a number of topics that are relevant to the majority of the sites that we'll be going to, especially hazardous secondary materials. So it's important to just look at that portion as well and keep that in mind. If you could move to the next one. So especially since the inspection won't be taking place in person, it's important to really focus on communication, both on and as inspecting sites, but also from your end, from sites being inspected. And just keep in mind, if you have questions, please reach out to us. We can't read body language or have that one-on-one interaction as easily at this point. So if you have questions on what records are being requested and what those individually mean, what the process is, what the timeline for that process, if you have concerns that because of a slowdown or a shutdown, staff aren't on site anymore, and you'll have difficulty getting in, accessing the documents to get them to us, please let us know. We try our best to work with everyone and be as accommodating as we reasonably can be. And to that point as well, we recognize that a lot of facilities have individuals working remotely. The majority of our inspectors are working remotely at this point. So if you know that there's going to be any issue with actually accessing the site, please let us know in advance, because while we're trying to coordinate the actual on-site inspection as a somewhat scheduled, we know approximately when we might be coming out, obviously with a records request and an opening conference, you'll have some idea that we're coming. Our goal is still to have this be unannounced and show up notify you as close to when we're arriving on site as possible. So if you could move forward, Marcy. The records that we're going to be asking for in the email are laid out here. Typically a map of the facility, Doesn't have to, include all of the schematics for the site. If you have just something along the lines of an emergency map to show areas, and if you can indicate where waste is stored, be it satellite accumulation areas, central accumulation areas, universal waste, that is ideal on our end, because it really helps us understand the flow of your site and where we're going to be wanting to, focus some of our attention. That waste stream information package is really going to be any profiles you have, any supporting documentation that you would have in the form of analytical results, safety data sheets, things of that nature. And that, is really, we're looking for not just your hazardous waste, but also your non-hazardous waste as well. Because for us, it really can be important to make sure that when any waste is determined to not be a hazardous waste, is to understand why it's out, either through the supporting documentation, exclusions. As part of the hazardous waste manifest, we're also going to be looking for, it's going to be a targeted time slot for various months within a time frame, and we're also going to be looking for land disposal restriction forms that go with that for those waste streams and any of the waste stream information package as well, to make sure that those land disposal restriction forms were sent properly for each of those waste streams. If there's any times that those manifests weren't received within the appropriate time frame, either 45 days or 60 days, depending on the status of the generator status of the facility, we're going to want to see those reports for the previous 3 years, annual reports for the previous 3 years, and central accumulation area weekly inspection logs for the previous 3 years. Training documentation, please keep in mind that this covers not just the initial and annual hazardous waste training for any individuals that are handling or managing hazardous waste on site. We'll also be looking for documentation for contingency plan training has taken place, and that universal waste handling training has taken place. And this covers not just how it needs to be handled, but how, if there's an emergency, what training individuals have received to make sure that they know how to respond. We'll be looking for records of any exempt waste. That covers situations that are, say, waste is discharged to a sanitary sewer, or an exclusion for, say, precious metals are sent for reclamation and excluded that manner. So we'll be looking for any waste that you say now don't meet the hazardous waste regs. Universal waste, we're looking for disposal records to help indicate that waste is stored less than a year on site for universal waste, be it lamps, batteries, pesticides, mercury-containing equipment, all of those. Next slide, please, Marcy. That same premise applies to used oil. Obviously, there isn't a 1-year time cap, but we want to see, if you have records to indicate that waste is being properly disposed of. As far as the exclusions, one of the ones that we're trying to dial in on and make sure is tracked properly is the excluded solvent contaminated wipes. It's an exclusion that we see frequently used on sites, but please be aware that there's a document component to this as well. Some work that needs to be done in addition to just sending it off site for disposal. There needs to be a number of things. We have a guidance document that really goes into depth on what those records are and provides a really nice template for that. We're looking for a contingency plan, hazardous waste storage tank certification and inspection records. So that initial installation and tightness testing, if the tank is storing hazardous waste, not just if it's organic in nature, those need to be in place. If they're historic, installed prior to 1991 or more recent, though, that can change what's expected, but be aware that we'll expect to see those records. And then there's a daily inspection component that needs to be recorded and provided as well. And that kind of leads into records associated with organic air emission standards. So be aware, facilities, printers especially, that are managing a large volume of solvents. If you're a large quantity generator, you're likely subject to subchapter B, B, and CC for those solvents that you're using, unless there's an exclusion that's taking place, potentially such as hazardous secondary materials, which I'll give a plug for that final presentation again at the end. But be aware that if you have those, you may need to be testing for leaks and tracking a lot of those individual components and ancillary equipment pieces for those transferring and carrying that waste through your facility, in addition to any air regulations that you might be meeting with the air management program with the DNR. And last but not least, in the unlikely event that you are actually treating any of the waste on site, you'll need a waste analysis plan. And I saw a question pop up from Gary about the documentation for training, and I'll just touch on that really quickly. How frequent do you have to train your employees in hazardous waste, well, hazardous and universal waste training? Is there a difference based on the size of the generator? So the hazardous waste training is initial and then annually. As far as universal waste, that is initial, and then those really don't tie into large quantity versus small quantity so much. The one that does is if you're a large quantity generator, you have a contingency plan that needs to be trained initially as well. And I personally recommend that if the individuals are working in the office, there's a 15 to 30 minute discussion with staff about what that contingency plan is, where it, that it exists, and just how they can use it. Obviously, the majority of your staff aren't necessarily going to need to enact any portion of it, but being aware that it exists helps people know how to start that process, or to make people aware that there's a process at all. So if you could please move forward, Marcy. So all of this information will be reviewed by the inspector for a records review portion, and it'll lead to a preparation for our opening conference. And depending on what we see, it may prompt additional requests for additional records. If there's any specific exclusions that are being used that we may ask to see more information for, or if there's pieces that we're potentially missing. Say if we recognize that the process on site likely does need fugitive emission documentation, then we'll likely ask for additional records either during the opening conference or prior to it. If you could move ahead, please. So once we've had a chance to review those records, we'll reach out again and schedule that opening conference to lay out some basics of the site. You can expect that to be 1 to 2 hours, depending on the size and complexity of your site. You are welcome to invite anyone that you would like to, that you believe would be relevant to the discussion. Most likely, it will only be the inspector from the DNR side, unless you would like someone additionally present. I personally, with one generator, had them, they asked if they could have 10 different people be on the call. I had no issue with it. I was entirely up to them. If you could please move forward. So when that opening conference is taking place, these are a lot of the pieces that we're really trying to drill into, is to understand that history of the site from a demographic standpoint. EPA is asking us to make sure in a lot of our reports that we cover some basics so that from a holistic standpoint, they can keep a consistent approach for tracking demographics. But beyond that, we really want to know how the site is operating and the individual processes from a waste stream standpoint that lead to the generation of the waste and how it's managed on site, how it's disposed, where it's being stored. And so, you know, please be aware that we'll likely ask a lot of very specific questions about initially what your general process is, but then dialing in on how that process plays out in different portions, what equipment you have, what different chemicals are used, and then how that whole process feeds together. During that process, we'll try and loop back to any issues that we've initially noted during that records review and any questions that need clarification either through that opening conference or that records review portion. I personally try and cover any alleged violations that I note during the records review upfront during the opening conference so that sites have a chance to either give their perspective on it or to start working on already returning to compliance on those individual components. Some of that can be, say, missing information on land disposal restriction forms or simply never having them for some of the waste streams going out. If you could please move forward, Marcy. So a lot of this information will help also tie together as to whether or not a facility self-audit will make sense for the site or if an on-site inspection is necessary. And that's something that will be determined on the department side through a review process. And I'll touch on what the actual self-audit looks like in just a moment. But I wanted to touch on what the inspection areas that we're typically looking at and what we'd ask you to look at are. So points of generation or specific waste stream generation processes. And here I've got a picture of both a distillation unit producing still bottoms as a point of generation, and then a plating press producing plating sludge as individual site process specific that have exclusions associated with them that would likely need to be reviewed or looked at in more detail. Next, we would have, if you can move forward, Marcy, the satellite or central accumulation areas. We're definitely going to want to see what those areas look like, how they're being labeled, how the containers are being managed, making sure that they're closed, and that the containers are appropriate, and just make sure that the areas are properly being maintained as well. Next, please. We'll want to take a look at your universal waste storage areas, used oil storage areas, and any non-hazardous waste storage areas. And that's to make sure that those containers, once again, are being, are in good condition, that the expectations are being met for containers needing to be closed, properly labeled, but also, especially in the case of the non-hazardous waste, to make sure we have a holistic understanding of where the waste is coming from a generation standpoint and how it's ending. And that helps us understand if there's any potential for mischaracterization to have taken place through the process. Next, please. We'll also want to take a look, there we go, at any hazardous waste tanks, ancillary equipment, piping, or process flows, just to make sure we understand beginning to end how that works, but also to drill into some of those areas that have additional regulatory components. In this situation, these are hazardous waste tanks that don't have a volatile organic component to it, but likely with most printers, any hazardous waste tanks that are on site are going to have those, and they're going to have piping associated with it, and we're really going to want to understand how that waste starts and flows through that whole process. And that, unfortunately, will also likely have, what will play into the next slide, which is that applicability of fugitive emission standards. And that got a little bit cut off on the bottom, it looks like for mine, but it's looking at pumps, it's looking at piping, it's looking at valves. And if that applies to a site, please be aware that likely we're going to be asking for piping and instrumentation diagram so that we understand all of the ancillary components that are involved and be able to follow it from a desktop review standpoint, but also walking on site to see how that flows and make sure we understand if it's potentially eligible for exclusion or not. And unfortunately, every site is very specific for how these rules apply in a case-by-case situation. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers when it comes to fugitive emission standards. And one of the last areas on the next slide will be kind of looking also a little bit more closely at some of those broader eligibility for exclusions. On the left have elementary neutralization tanks, and the right is the excluded solvent contaminated wipes. So not only is there a paperwork component for that excluded solvent contaminated wipes, there also is labeling and container requirements in order to be eligible for that exclusion. So we're going to be wanting to see both a paperwork aspect to those exclusions, but also on the ground to make sure that it's appropriate and they're being met. Because if they aren't, then they fall into likely the broader hazardous waste regulatory framework and have additional expectations from a labeling, closure, container standpoint. So next slide, please. Looking at the self-audit portion, it's a lot more dialed in and focused from a walkthrough standpoint for any sites to be doing. Where there's a photo component as well as a focused form component. For our photos, really what we're going to be asking is all of those areas I just discussed. We would be normally taking photos of those ourselves. We would be asking, and through that opening conference and records review, we'll be identifying specific areas that we'll want photos, wide angle photos, close-up photos. But as a general expectation, any of those components I just covered, that's really what we're looking for from a photo documentation standpoint. We have a photo log that we'll be providing if a self-audit is determined to make sense for the site. And that has instructions in it for how we would like those photos to be recorded. From the forms standpoint, that is the goal of that is to have the site specifically walk through and do an honest self-assessment to see whether or not problems exist, to recognize how they need to be fixed and to document that they're fixed, and then to train employees to avoid that issue from occurring again. And really, that's what we're looking for from that self-audit standpoint. You know, what we'll be looking for to see is, you know, whether or not any of those alleged violations, you know, are recorded on that self-audit form. We would expect to see those. But keep in mind also that likely the areas that we're asking to look at aren't the document portion that we've already taken a look at. So if you could move forward, Marcy. That form itself covers these areas specifically. And that form, the photo log, all of that will be emailed to you in the case that self-audit is determined to be appropriate for your site. Next slide, please. So the final portion of that would be a closing conference, which once again would be virtual. And the goal of that really is to communicate any issues that we've observed on site through the records review process, through the opening conference discussions, to notify the facility, the site of those issues, and to really help you understand how to return to compliance on those individual issues. And that's really one of your best opportunities to understand what our expectations of you are, and to help understand, you know, your best path forward to achieving those. Because usually there's more than one solution available for a lot of the issues that potentially are on site, whether or not it's changing a process, updating your actual equipment, be it containers, funnels, the closure devices on those, or just reassessing how you're labeling any of your hazardous waste to really better get at the best way to resolve those and avoid issues in the future. Likely any outstanding documents or records will be covered at that point too. And it really also then is the best opportunity to just lay out what the next steps are from an enforcement standpoint. So if you could please move forward. If there's no issues observed on site, there's a letter that's called a letter of no non-compliance, a notice of no non-compliance that would be sent. It's very short. Most commonly, though, there's a notice of non-compliance, which just identifies those alleged areas of non-compliance and sets forward our expectation for when we'll receive information. But be aware, please, that during that whole process, and this is true for the notice of violation and any additional potential enforcement beyond that, until those are documented to be resolved, the alleged violations are considered to be continuing in those circumstances. So in the notice of violation, that's a form of escalated enforcement. An enforcement conference call, either virtual or in person, will take place and be scheduled, and you'll be notified of that. Depending on the severity of the violations, if they're reoccurring ones, from past inspections, or if they reach, a level of severity, they potentially will be referred directly to the Department of Justice. Or if there's impasses that we reach within the enforcement process, there may also ultimately be a referral with the potential for fines and penalties at that point. So that is the first portion of the presentation, talking about the inspection process. And I just want to take a little bit of time now to talk about my perspective on how this has changed the dynamic. If you could move to the next slide. So personally, I think this has been a good opportunity, and it has worked well. It provides safe options to continue inspections, both from a safety standpoint from ourselves as inspectors, from the DNR, but also for the site to help minimize introduction of new individuals onto the site. Most of the sites we go to, everybody's trying to minimize the number of new individuals that are coming on site. So not only are we limiting the individuals going to the sites, but we're also able to limit that time window that we're on site. It helps streamline and provide greater clarity for what we're looking for documents. It allows facilities to upgrade and provide enhanced training on site through that self-audit process. And one that I've heard really good feedback on is the dispersed impact on site staff scheduling. Often when we arrive on site in that 4 to 8 hours, potentially multiple days, there's multiple individuals who are involved in that walkthrough typically with us. And that can be a large drain on their schedules and be very disruptive. And having that spread over weeks for that document review portion and having that spread over multiple smaller bits tends to work better for everyone's schedule and actually be a positive. Move to the next one. So I wanted to also touch on record keeping. So just some brief reminders, both from a inspection, in-person normal inspection process, but through this records request standpoint, the records are always expected to be readily available. It may be useful to get ahead of the curve now for any potential inspections you have either with us or any other agencies and digitize the records, because while hopefully COVID-19 doesn't persist too much into our near future, some of these components are going to be most easily communicated in a digital format going forward. And some of the document systems already exist externally to help you not have to track all these documents yourselves. Manifests are a really good example of that through the e-manifest system. To be able to, once you know that those final versions of the documents are on there, you can use that as a tracking method to demonstrate compliance that you've retained those documents. So Next slide, please. Some of those best practices that I wanted to touch on for waste determinations, it is best in our standpoint from a review to have all of these components all in one place. That's the waste profile itself, that's the land disposal restriction, then any supporting documents all in one location for waste determination. And that's easiest as opposed to keeping those land disposal restriction forms with a manifest, because that expectation for that land disposal restriction form is for it to be with the initial shipment. So that initial land disposal restriction form can easily get lost, and often we'll be presented with the most recent land disposal restriction form, but waste streams tend to change over time, and that initial can be lost and then ultimately result in potential regulatory compliance issues. So anytime that waste stream changes and that initial shipment, it's best to keep that copy separate with that actual waste stream information. And a lot of this information we have a template. The expectations, once again, are in that guidance document that I referenced earlier. And I have a slide just touching on where you can get those again. As Andrea points out, and I touch on in the next slide, we have a training guidance document as well in that guidance, as well in our guidance documents. So yes, here, please be aware that the best way for us to be able to assess your inspections of your central accumulation areas is to have those weekly logs. And it really is best both from your endpoint and from ours, when you're creating or reviewing those weekly inspection logs, to look at what they are trying to capture. A lot of times when I go on site, I see those just having space for, initialing, saying, yes, this was inspected. What I really try and recommend to sites is take a look from the perspective of, why are you inspecting it? You want to capture if there's any issues. You want to capture how they're assessed and addressed for those areas, any remediation actions, if there's missing labels, if there's drums that aren't properly closed, if anything's leaking. Because from our standpoint, showing that you have those, we know those types of things happen when someone's doing an inspection, and actually being able to capture and demonstrate that you're assessing those is more valuable, because it shows that those inspections are being taken seriously and are meaningfully addressing issues. Because every site will miss a label here and there, and never seeing an issue in an inspection log can raise more concerns and flags than recording them and properly addressing them. So some sites, from a used oil standpoint, from universal waste standpoint, will not keep those records and end up having to reach back out to their vendors to get copies of them, because in their mind, it's not hazardous. They don't need to keep them. But be aware, in order to demonstrate that the waste has actually been disposed of in a recent time frame, disposed of properly, your records of that disposal are going to be your best, clearest indication. And then touching on those training records again that I already touched on, be aware that we're looking for not just that initial and annual hazardous waste training. We're looking for a whole slew of training to be taking place that's required on sites. And to plug that training document, please move forward. We have a lot of guidance documents covering a lot of these areas that you're going to be most interested in, how do you actually meet these records standpoint, but also how do you meet them on site. And for a better, more complete review of that, I recommend going back to that first presentation. I hear that spent a good amount of time talking about guidance documents. A number of these guidance documents even have templates and built-in discussions on best practices. So I highly recommend looking at them. I often hand out copies when I'm on an inspection to point out their value. So go to that website, dnr.wi.gov, and search for hazardous waste resources to find those. Next slide, please. So as I want to touch, my last portion is to touch on emergency preparedness and some of the violations associated with it. And I wanted to call out a component that is now on board as of the September 1st rule promulgation, which is the quick reference guide. Oh, sorry, that quick reference guide. Sorry, this is two separate pieces. We have a quick reference guide for our generator regulatory requirements from both a very small, and large quantity generator standpoint for a crosswalk, just to make sure you understand what those individual components and requirements are for you as a different levels of a generator, because your documentation from a emergency preparedness standpoint differs pretty largely, and how you have to display that between being a small quantity generator and a large quantity generator. So if you have questions on that, I highly recommend looking at the quick reference guide first, and then if you have additional questions, please feel free to contact us directly. If you can move forward, please. So what are some of those issues that we see frequently from a paperwork standpoint? We most often see a failure to update emergency contacts, emergency coordinators. This is one I see probably 1 in 3 facilities have an issue with this. Someone moves on and either none of the contact coordinators are still present but listed, never gets updated. That please check that and make sure that you keep it up to date. That ties into failure to notify local authorities and failure to obtain records of notifying local authorities. This especially is relevant for the contingency plan, because when you update that emergency coordinator, this triggers the need to notify local authorities again. As far as retaining records of that, that can easily be in the form of an email showing that the document was sent to them, the most recent version of it, or if you send it by mail, keeping a copy of that cover letter just to indicate, this is who we sent it to, and that we sent it and when we sent it. Next, please. So from a small quantity generator standpoint, some of the issues that I've seen, failure to have a phone or alarm near the central accumulation area, and then in a lot of these situations, there's no allowance for cell phones or pagers. So there isn't any way for individuals that are in those areas to communicate that emergency is taking place. And there is a code requirement for those to be present. In addition, small quantity generators need to post that emergency contact information near their phones. And that involves the emergency coordinator, location of that equipment, and phone number of the local fire department. And so this is something that I see, unfortunately, pretty regularly going to small quantity generators. And this needs to be more than just the front office number. This needs to be where anyone that would be reporting an emergency would need to have access to this. Next slide, please. I've also seen failure to provide adequate fire suppression systems. Each site has different needs. In this situation, this was a facility that had stockpiled a large amount of batteries. In the case of solvents on site, you might have different fire suppression needs than just having a large amount of water on site. But that is a consideration that needs to be taken into account. Next, please. Having adequate aisle space, emergency egress. Next slide, please. Another example of lack of aisle space, and that's especially for responding to any leaks, or if there's any pressure buildup or emergencies taking place with any of the containers in the areas. Next slide, please. And then failure to have, in that same sense, failure to have labels facing outward for any hazardous waste containers. And in the case of an emergency, it's important to be able to see what those containers hold. Next, please. So this is that quick reference guide from a new regulation standpoint that I touched on briefly earlier. It's from September 1st. For large quantity generators, there is now a guide that needs to be provided to first responders from a local standpoint. Current LQGs are grandfathered in, but be aware whenever a change to that contingency plan that would take place, from needing to update, say, the emergency coordinator, that quick reference guide needs to be submitted along with that contingency plan to those first responders. We're in the process of developing a Qrg guidance document, which has a template for you to be able to flesh out. In the meantime, I highly recommend looking at EPA's Qrg FAQ that they have up on their website as part of their generator improvement rule explanation, which gives a good amount of details. Next, please. So I also, like I said earlier, just want to plug the hazardous secondary materials session coming up on February 23rd. From one of the printers I had inspected, at that point, they hadn't really assessed their compliance or lack of compliance with fugitive emission standards, and ultimately they were able to come into compliance by meeting HSM, that hazardous secondary materials. And these were an example of tanks and piping systems that actually were eligible for it. So I highly recommend attending the next session to have a better understanding of hazardous secondary materials and how they might impact your site. All right, next slide, which leads us to questions. And I'll pop open the chat and I'll try and address questions from the material I covered here first, but then when I'm done with that, the goal is to broaden a question and answer to previous topics and previous sessions in case there's time for that at the end. So going back, I see there was a comment that most guests request LDRs with every shipment. That is true. It depends on the company that you're working with, whether or not they're an intermediary or you're working with the TSDF directly for your disposal needs. Some will produce an LDR with every shipment. Some will make sure that you have one and ship it with the waste every single time as well. Be aware that the regulatory requirement for that LDR is that it's present at the initial shipment and present anytime that waste stream changes as well. Can you elaborate on the differences between when a facility would receive an NON versus an NLB? So that's really, unfortunately, somewhat of a, yeah, go ahead, Andrea, please feel free to take
Would you like me to take that one? Yeah. So this
Absolutely.
is Andrea Keller speaking. Yeah, this is Andrea Keller. I'm the Hazardous Waste Prevention and Management Section Chief for the program. And there's a lot of different factors that really determine, kind of what level of stepped enforcement the program ends up taking. And typically it has to do with elements that facilities have some control over. So in some cases, it has to do with timeliness and responsiveness. So if we're trying to determine compliance with the facility, but there's information lacking or documents lacking or kind of a responsiveness that's lacking from the facility that an NON maybe has been issued and we're just not capable of completing the CEI or our full evaluation, we might end up moving to the next stage of stepped enforcement. Some violations have been somewhat weighted by EPA in the program based on their potential for environmental harm or employee exposure, and those violations typically can merit or push a facility towards an NOV directly. And so it's really a case-by-case situation, and we understand that there's a lot of facilities that have a lot of kind of pressure to minimize their enforcement, and it comes on a lot of really good programs, a lot of good, a lot of good training, a lot of good efforts on behalf of the facility. And so my recommendation is just really early communication and early responsiveness, and really kind of talking through the issues. I think in many cases can keep things kind of at a lower level without escalating. The other thing to note too is that the federal government doesn't really view, they don't see a difference in an NON and an NOV. They really just have two stages of enforcement. They have the notice of violation, and then they have their kind of equivalency to what we would call a referral, where we would engage the Department of Justice in the state. So the thing that's really interesting to note there is that if EPA does come on site, pretty much regardless of the type of violation that is alleged or determined, you would see an NOV from EPA. And that can be a little confusing as well as to why the state would have multiple tiers of enforcement versus the federal agency. But we feel that the NON is usually the first course of action, and sometimes what you'll see is an NON letter with some unresolved issues, with an opportunity to kind of keep moving towards getting them resolved in order to kind of head off any further step enforcement. So again, if you do end up down this path and you are, open for more discussion, you want to have more communication, I really do recommend, we've got resources to kind of assist you. Our staff want to assist you. We all want to just get things resolved as soon as possible and get everybody back into compliance as soon as possible. So, compliance through technical assistance isn't a joke. We're kind of here to help you figure out how to move forward, and we need to understand your process too, because you're the experts of your facility and of your processes and of your documents, and so it turns into a bit of a collaborative effort.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, I just want to reiterate as well, while we can't act as consultants with sites, if you have questions, as Andrea said, we're more than happy to try and, work with you and understand any questions you have for specific regulations. The inspectors, one of our main parts of our jobs is to act as technical resources to the public. So if you have questions that, you aren't able to resolve on your own, please reach out to us and just, keep us in the loop on them. And at the very least, hopefully we can point you to resources that might be able to better clarify questions, concerns before they become non-compliance issues. Yeah. Thank you, Andrea. I covered the contacting, documenting contact with local emergency authorities. Personally, I prefer, I actually don't have a preference between having a cover letter that indicates that stuff was sent to individual departments or an email. I guess probably it's just as easy to have an email to demonstrate it, but just as long as you have some documentation. As far as, can you elaborate on what constitutes a closed container for collection of universal waste bulbs in a box? From labeling standpoint, just to not to nitpick, but from a regulatory labeling standpoint, make sure that you use lamps, not bulbs. I know we in the US describe the individual elements as bulbs. From a regulatory standpoint, make sure that you label it as lamps. Otherwise, that'd be a non-compliance. So specifically, does the flap on the end of the box where the bulbs are being added need to be securely closed with tape, even if the box is not full? So the best way that I could describe this is, imagine you've got the box, even if the flaps are, resting closed on it. If it were to tip over, there would be really nothing to prevent those from coming out. Does it need to be taped and closed? No. Could you fold those flaps to keep it closed? Absolutely, that would be considered closed. Could you use Velcro to secure those? Absolutely. could you use a different, container lid or create your own cardboard lid for a box that could slide over that? Absolutely. But just having the cardboard loosely resting on itself really wouldn't be considered closed in the case of a box. I showed a picture of the universal waste tubes for lamps earlier. I know sometimes they can be somewhat challenging for some sites from a space standpoint, but one of the things that I really love about those and I recommend for sites is that you can pull that lid on and off as many times as you want and not have to deal with taping, Velcro, any of those issues until the time to set it off site. And typically the vendor will end up dealing with any type of taping issue they need to at that point. There's a lot of different solutions to that question. And I see we're at our time limit. I don't know. I'm fine with sticking around to answer any additional questions if there's more questions.
So Ben, this is Marcy. I think we
you.
should just go ahead and we'll move to the next few slides. And I do encourage people to go ahead and take a look at the webinars that have been previously offered to see if you do have any questions. As Ben and Andrea stated, they have quite a bit of technical guidance and information available on their website, as well as you can contact them directly if you have specific questions. So I do know they do provide quite a bit of technical assistance and they're willing to help you. Their goal is, as they stated, is really to bring people into compliance as quickly as possible. And that is one of our underlying goals for this series of webinars, is to update everyone on the changes to the hazardous waste generator standards, as well as provide you some information that you can use now as you move through and get your facility up and operating, hopefully at a more robust pace. That is our goal. And I do want to provide Ben's direct contact information. And as I stated today, we will be sending out a copy of this recording as well as a copy of the slides to all participants. So Joe, any last questions in the chat box?
No, that's it.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending our program. Stay tuned for our next program, which will be on hazardous secondary materials. I echo Ben. Please plan to attend our last in the series. And again, if you have any questions whatsoever, you can contact us, and you can always contact Joe at the Great Lakes Graphics Association. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our program today.